What's a scary story from your childhood? Part 1? Please like and subscribe to support this channel. The haunted wood clock of my mom's. When my sister and I were 4 and 5 years old, we swore, even to this day, that there was a witch laughing at us, coming from the living room. My sister and I thought it was coming from the TV. A few years later, we had moved into a different place, and as I went to sneak out of my room for a midnight snack, I heard ticking from the clock getting louder and louder. I stopped dead in my tracks, and this faint song came out of nowhere, to the beat of the ticking sound. Mr. Frost is a bad man, Mr. Frost is a Grinch. Mr. Frost is a dead man, beat him within an inch. I ran back to my room and never went back out for another snack at night, again. I mentioned this moment in here, around a year or two ago, and back then, I assumed that this was coming from my dad's brown pocket watch. Since then, my family and I discussed the uneasiness we've all felt around this clock, and my sister said, "Do you remember the witch laughing?" It struck me. The watch of my dad's wasn't around when we heard it. We don't know why or how or if it's even real, but we believe that this clock is cursed. When I was 16 to 17, my dad had issues. We were in some financial trouble. He didn't send in the payment to the IRS. He and mom got in a huge fight. He just walked out the door into his brother's house a mile away. After a while, mom sent me to take his vehicle, some clothes, and his high blood pressure meds. I drove up to uncle's house, quickly hopped out, and began to walk back home. Dad flew out the door, screaming at me to come back and get everything. I didn't turn around or speak. I continued walking. I heard the door slam once and then again a minute or two after. He's still furious. Next I heard 2 deafening gunshots. I wasn't hit and didn't see the bullets impact anywhere near me. It still scared the fuck out of me. I sprinted my ass home as fast as I could run. I realized I was close enough that he could have hit me, if he had wanted to. But I was still afraid of him for several years after. I was home alone once. Maybe 11 or 12 years old. And this weird guy was pacing on my driveway on his cell phone talking to somebody. Eventually he came up to the front door and tried to open it. It was locked. I was watching him through the blinds. Then he just walked away, still talking on the phone. I dunno, it was scary at the time, but I still don't know WTF was going on. The way he just absent-mindedly tried to break into my house while talking on the phone was hard to understand. But looking back on it now, maybe it was a cover so he would appear casual chatting on his phone and not casing a house? I dunno. I was probably about 6 or 7 and my older sister 12-ish. We had recently moved to a new place and decided to play Barbies in a field just up the road on an elementary school ground. Mid-90s, less than 200 meters from home, a man came up to us, and I distinctly remember him swaying, obviously not understanding alcohol effects and/or drugs. He came out of nowhere, it seemed, and he asked if we had seen his little black dog he had lost. We said no, sorry, and he proceeded to pull his pants down in front of us and started taking a piss. All I remember after that was him scratching his nuts or something and saying, "The flies are really biting tonight." My sister looked at me and said, "Run." We grabbed our babies so fucking fast, ran right home. I honestly don't know what happened of that. I remember telling my mom, and then we were in some sort of martial arts. Never saw that man again. When I was about 11/12, my mom lived in an apartment building, and the door to her apartment was next to a hall with the stairs. One day, we were heading out to the store, so I opened the door and there was a man standing outside our door. He was immediately spooked and took off running down the stairs and out of our building, and we never saw him again. Scared the shit out of me, and I still often wonder if he was just listening outside our door or what. I was in grade 5 or 6 and I was at a friend, Hans' place with a few others for a sleepover party. We decided to go out for a walk around the block when it was dark. I was kinda freaked out by that. I was a nervous kid and didn't know the area too well, but I agreed to go. We got to the end of his street to a main drag and I was like, "Nah, we should go back home." My friends disagreed and wanted to go on. I just said I was heading back and turned around. Then I heard them like whisper shouting my name. I turned around and they're hiding behind a car and frantically gesturing me over to them. In the middle of the road, this car has stopped, headlights on, just idling there. There was something really sinister about it. I ran over to my friends and they said the car had stopped and crept along when it saw me walking alone. We decided to make a break for it down an alleyway that would lead back to where we'd come from. We ran so fast, but at the other end of the alley, bam, the car pulls to a stop and sees us. We turn and run back the other way and eventually make it back to my friend's house. When we get there, we realize one of our friends, Andy, is missing. We tell Han's dad about it and we go back down the alleyway we'd tried to escape down and found Andy sitting with a lady on her porch. Turns out, he'd thrown himself into their hedges to hide from the guys in the car while we ran off. The car had stopped and the guys had gotten out and looked for him. They walked to this lady's garden and her floodlights had come on. They got back in their car and drove off, while Andy went to get help from the lady. We were all shaken but unhurt and we'd come so close to being hurt or kidnapped or whatever. Before I hit double digits, don't fully remember what my age was, but know it was before I was 10, my stepmother's ex came over drunk. He was the bio dad of my step-siblings, who let him in. He was raving about how he was going to kill my dad, and the kids who weren't his, which is me and my sister who was only a couple of months old at the time. I ran to we 3 girls shared a bedroom and hid in the closet. I know, not a smart move, but I was a scared little kid. The door was open just a crack so I could see him come into the room a couple of times as my stepmother was trying to get him to leave. I heard a lot of noise at one point, and then I saw cops come into the room so I got out of the closet. I went into the kitchen and saw blood on the floor, counters, stove, and there were a few things broken. The ex had tried to fight my dad, but being drunk, did not have the upper hand. My dad being tired of his BS didn't work in the ex's favor either. The ex was arrested and he was the only one who really got hurt that night. The friend who brought him to our house was charged as an accomplice. And I have a recurring nightmare that pops up from time to time. Driving to a campground with my uncle and my dad. We saw a trailer with a tire off and a bunch of transmission fluid all over the dirty pavement. I was so impressed my uncle, a mechanic, could identify transmission fluid that quickly driving by. Next day we read in the local paper the guy was smashed under the truck. What my uncle said was transmission fluid ended up being blood. Turns out he was trying to protect me and they thought it was blood the whole time. Still remember what that looked like. When I was about 10 and my brother was 13, we were walking home around dusk and a white panel van pulled up and a man said our mom had sent him to give us a ride home. Me being completely naive and innocent stared getting in and my brother right behind me at the last second was suspicious and told me to run with him so we bolted. Years later I've never forgotten that and the older I get, the more it freaks me out but mostly I get mad that we didn't get a license plate and call the cops because who knows what else that guy did later. I was riding my bike around my town when a car full of people started following me and then started passing me really close and then driving around the block to do it again. After 2 of these, I took off down an alley to avoid them but they followed me. One of the people in the back seat rolled down their window, pointed a gun at me, and pulled the trigger. At that point I made a beeline for my friend's house riding down the sidewalk on a one-way street going opposite traffic. I jumped my friend's fence and pulled my bike over into his lawn. Then I burst into his house and called the police. Now as an adult, I have thought about it and I'm nearly certain that the gun was a fake or a pellet gun or something. There was no sound and no muzzle flash. But back then I was totally messed up for like a year after that. I was terrified of being alone and I always looked over my shoulder whenever I was walking or riding my bike anywhere. I started imagining that car everywhere I went and freaked out whenever I saw one that looked like it. I'm not sure when I got over it, but it took a long time. When I was around 8 or 9 I was out playing with some friends in a field near my house. We were playing for a few hours and having fun but slowly the number of us grew fewer as people needed to head home. Eventually it was just me and a friend. We said our goodbyes and started making our ways home. We went in different directions. I saw a group of people start making their way in my general direction from back and to the right but I didn't put any pass on them and just kept walking leisurely. It looked like they were going perpendicular to the direction I was so didn't have any reason to be alarmed. I then heard heavy footfalls as a few of them started running at me. I reacted too late to run and I was punched in the face and fell to the ground in shock and crying. The one who punched me grabbed me by my collar and punched me again twice while I screamed for him to leave me alone. I could see his posse laughing and egging him on. The guy then stood up and looked around and found a fairly large rock and held it over his head while standing over me. One of his friends managed to talk him out of dropping the rock on me, which may have killed me. It was a big fucking rock, and the group started walking away. I was still hysterical and scrambled to my feet and ran towards my home screaming for help. I then could see me dad running towards me. He must have been out looking to see why I didn't come home yet. I ran into his arms and gave him the biggest hug I could muster while babbling about bad boys and pointing in the direction of the group who were now a fair distance away. But I could hear them all guffawing. I remember at the time thinking my dad will sort them out. I saw him look at the group, look down at me, then console me and carried me home. For some time I felt resentment that my superhero didn't beat up the bad guys and felt my dad cowered away. This shattered my image of him as my superhero. Since then I have realized there was very little my dad could have done in that instance, and I shouldn't have felt the way I did. But I was young and didn't know better. When I was 3 and my older brother was 5, he was doing some homework at the coffee table in the living room while I ran around playing. He turned his pencil over to erase something as I ran by, and I happened to trip at that moment and fall onto the pencil. It went into my right eye. Bro pulled the pencil out of my eye as soon as he realized what happened. I started screaming, which brought my parents from the next room. They couldn't get a straight story out of the two of us, and there was no blood, so we moved on with our evening. Went to bed. The next morning, I had fluid from my eye dried on my cheek and my eye looked deflated. We went to the hospital, they found the injury, and took me into surgery to close the wound in my eye. I'm surprisingly okay. My vision on that side sucks because I have scarring to the back of my eyeball, but the pencil didn't go further. I wear corrective glasses that enable me to see fairly well with that eye. As imaging technology has progressed, I've even gotten to see what the injury looks like at the eye doctor. That was cool for me, because everyone else looked at my injury at the doctor's office for years when I was a kid, but I could never see it. There's a little graphite mark at the back of my eye. So yeah, my eyeball got impaled on a pencil, but I'm fine now. When I was about 8 to 10 years old, I had friends who lived down the street from me that had an alcoholic father who beat their mom. Even though this family had their difficulties, they still treated me like part of the family. My house was also a safe haven for the kids in that family that needed to leave when their father was drinking. Well, one night, I was sleeping over at that family's house and I couldn't sleep in my friend's room because they were being loud, so I decided to sleep on their couch. While in that state between sleep and being awake, I remember the dad tickling my feet a few times. After that, I remember feeling the band of my underwear snap and nothing else. What's scary to me is that I'm not sure if something else happened. I didn't tell my mom till years later, and she says it still makes her upset that she never knew. I don't know why I didn't say anything, I just never did. Sometimes I still think about that night and wonder if anything did happen that my brain is just repressing. This one is a really weird one, but my brother and I swear it happened. I just woke up, so my narrating skills are blah, but bear with me. When I was a kid, my cousin bought a devil mask for Halloween. Growing up in a super Catholic, Mexican home, that was a big no. My aunt refused to have it in her house and was upset that he had bought it without consulting her. She has always been the most religious of the family. To appease her, my grandmother took the mask to her house. She hated it too, but she just shoved it in a shoebox in the closet and forgot about it. However, something really bizarre and terrifying happened when I was a kid. The house my grandmother and I lived in was very tiny. It was a 2-bedroom house that had only 2 entrances. The kitchen was the center of the home and it had a plain view of the bedrooms and living room. The 2 entrances were in the kitchen, a small door that led to the backyard, and the front door in the living room. However, because the kitchen was the center of the house, you could see anyone that went in or out of the house from the kitchen. Essentially, that means that no one could sneak in the house without being seen by whoever was in the kitchen. So one day, my siblings and I are in the kitchen. My grandmother was the only other person in the house with us, but she was in the backyard watering the plants. She did that every morning when we ate breakfast, and we could see her that morning from the little window of the backyard door. Being kids, we start to bicker as we eat breakfast. I can't remember what we were bickering about, but it was something childish. My sister and I are raising our voices and arguing more and more animatedly. My brother tells us to stop because my grandmother will hear us and get mad, but then we hear something from one of the bedrooms. It sounded like someone was crying in one of the bedrooms. We could hear the sobs and hiccups of someone who was locked in one of the rooms. They sounded inconsolable. We looked at each other wondering who it was. We were alone in the house with our grandmother and she was in the backyard. It wasn't her. In our childish foolishness, we get up to go see. We walk to the bedrooms and see that only one is open. The guest room is open and no one is inside. The master bedroom has the door open a tiny crack but closed. We look through the little slit in the door and can see a woman with a white dress gown sitting on the corner of the bed with her head in her hands crying. She looks like my grandmother and is almost wailing. We look at each other wondering how she got in the room. She was in the backyard gardening. My sister turns around to go peek out the door to the backyard because we swear we can still hear the hose spraying outside. My brother and I get closer to the door and start inching the door open to go ask Grandma what's wrong, and then the woman lifts her face. Her hands are holding up my cousin's devil mask to her face. We scream and run. Our screaming gets our grandmother's attention and she opens the door from the backyard. We're inconsolable, wondering what the heck is happening because she was just in the room behind us. She's frantic, asking us what's wrong, and we can only utter something about the bedroom and the devil. She goes into the master bedroom and throws the door open. There's no one there. She goes to the shoebox with the mask, it's still there. She just stares at us and asks us what happened. When we tell her, she goes pale. She sees how frightened we are and knows we aren't lying, and she swears she didn't do it. She was in the backyard and couldn't have snuck in the house without us seeing it from the kitchen. The woman looked just like her, but it wasn't her. There was no explanation for it. My grandmother, in her Catholic mindset, told us that we probably drew the devil towards us by arguing. She tossed the mask in the trash and made us pray. However, she still maintains that it was not her that day. I believe her because she was super Catholic and definitely would not have touched that mask, much less wear it. Plus, there was no physically possible way she could have been in the master bedroom 1 minute and in the backyard the next. Still, my brother and I remember what we saw vividly and have no explanation for it. When I was roughly 4 or 5, I lived in a two-family home. My two cousins, both girls, one the same age as me, the other 3 years older, my mom, my aunt, my great-grandmother and I lived upstairs, and my great-great-grandmother lived by herself in the bottom half of the house. My cousins and I were really close, and I frequently snuck out of my mom's bed to go to their room. One night I woke up, and went to their room. Mom was dead asleep. My mom normally worked night shifts at the time, but tonight was her night off. I go into my cousin's room, and they have an idea for a game. Me being too young to realize anything is a bad idea, I agreed. So this game involves sealing one another into a large, airtight, storage box. The younger of the two cousins went first, and me being as crafty as I was, I got her out with the end part of a plug from some cord. Easy. My turn. Now, this box is made out of plastic, and it's roughly, very rough estimate, 2.5 FTLX1. 5 FTWX2FTH, and also has a airtight lid. I step into the box, and it's a tight fit. My knees go all the way to my forehead, and I don't have any room to move. For some reason or another, my cousins didn't even try to use the same method that I did, and they couldn't get the lid off. Me being 4-ish, I didn't think anything of it. I was just waiting to be let out. This next part is a little bit skewed. Around 7 to 8 years later, my mom is telling me this story. She told it something along the lines of, there was one night I had off, and I really should have slept through the night, but my motherly instinct woke me up. I noticed you weren't in bed, and immediately went to your cousin's room. Saw the box, ripped the lid off, and there you were, drenched in sweat, and completely unconscious. I thought you were dead. So yeah, obviously I couldn't remember the last part, but fun childhood memories, right? I'm a grown woman now. But when I was 11, I lived with my dad, who had just gotten a gig as a temporary principal for a junior high school in a semi-rural area. He had to start the job fairly quickly, so a kind teacher at the school let us rent his basement apartment. It was pretty sweet. The house was right next door to the school. Our landlord was a well-liked teacher with a wife and a daughter my own age. One evening, my dad had to pop out to his office to fix some things. This was in 1999, so we weren't all connected online. But I was lucky to have my own mobile phone, without internet. Obviously, I didn't expect to use it, as my dad is hearing impaired and usually didn't notice his phone ringing. Anyways, I expected him back in a few hours. No stress, I'm a big girl. There's a knock at the door. I can see it's the landlord, and he's also my school teacher, so I open the door and let him in. He just has a few questions, and he sits down in the couch. We talk a little, but I start feeling something's off. He seems a little drunk. His questions get invasive, and suddenly he gets up to give me a hug. I don't want a hug, and I got scared and managed to break away. He was trying to keep his grip on me. I actually start moving towards the door, but he blocks me. I am now severely freaked out. and I keep moving around the apartment while small talking about school and trying not to let my fear show. He is telling me not to be scared and that he's my teacher and just wants to get to know me better. This goes on for about half an hour. My dad suddenly comes home. He had a bad feeling. He immediately notices our landlord is drunk and tells him to get out. I told my dad everything, and we kept the door locked from then on. My dad had some acute health issues shortly after, and I had to stay with relatives. After he got well, we moved to a new place. However, we learned that a few weeks later, our landlord got arrested. He had been found at a gas station chugging denatured alcohol, and it turned out that he had been abusing and raping his wife and 11-year-old daughter for years. I was around 12. Wellington in NZ, where I grew up, is very hilly, so you'd often get streets built in valleys, etc. Our house's backyard was at the foot of a steep bank that was about 1 story or so high, with more houses up there. One day I saw a dead bird in our backyard. I walked over and saw that someone had carefully and methodically pushed maybe 100 nails all the way into the thing in a tightly packed pin-cushion grid square arrangement. I vividly remember how little space there was between them and how the flesh in there was like pate. I was super freaked out and I looked up, because where else could it have come from? And there at the top of the cliff, backlit by the overcast sky and in silhouette, was a little kid standing silently staring down at me. Absolute creepiest thing I ever saw. As a teenager, I could catch a bus a few blocks from home that would take me to the local station. 2 internet cafes were there. Great memories playing LAN with friends and others. Xmas time and I want to go to the net cafe on Boxing Day. Lucky duck, I got a phone for Xmas. A Nokia 5110. Had to charge it for hours before using. Did that. Used its alarm so I can wake up on time for the bus ride to the net cafes. Wake up. No alarm? Oh. The alarm is set, but I had set the wrong AM, PM time on the phone. That's okay, I'm only an hour late and we got all day. Walked down to the highway to catch my bus. Traffic was backed up, which seemed weird. Then noticed there was a road closure and had to catch the bus down the road. Okay. Did that, caught the bus. The bus drives past the bus stop I was supposed to be waiting at. The bus stop had been totaled, flattened. I asked the bus driver what's up. Oh, about an hour and a half ago a car went straight through the bus stop. Killed a bloke who was waiting there. If I had set the clock correctly on my phone, I would have been right on time in that spot, at that bus stop. Instead, I had a good time at the net cafe. It really didn't dawn on me how it played out until I reviewed the day later on. I'm more freaked out about it these days than when it went down. When I was about 7 to 8, I was visiting at my grandparents' house with my 2 cousins. The house is very secluded on the outskirts of a rural town. My mom, grandmother, and aunt were busy downstairs in a back room spring cleaning. Us 3 girls were upstairs playing. Taking a lunch break, my aunt called out to us from the upstairs kitchen. We walked in the kitchen and she asked us if we had been in her purse to play with her wallet. We said no and she thought she was missing some money, around $20. Me and one cousin volunteered to look for the money in her car in case it fell out. We went to the car, looked around and found nothing. My cousin accidentally slammed the door and she told me, "Shush, don't tell mom. She hates when I slam the door." I agreed and we went back upstairs. Minutes passed and we all started making sandwiches. My mother looked out the window and said, "Girls, you left the car door open." We ran to the window and we kind of froze for a second. We assured them that we did not leave any car doors open and confessed to actually slamming the door that was open. At this point, things kind of starting feeling creepy. First the wallet, now the car door. After watching the car for a while, we didn't see anyone and my mom bravely said she would close the door so the interior lights wouldn't run the battery down. Old car. When she went outside and closed the car door, the landline to the house rang. My grandmother answered and her face turned completely white. She started yelling for mother to get in the house and lock the door now. We all got upstairs and we hunkered down in the corner of room while my grandmother called 911. My mother reported feeling someone watching her when she was closing the car door. She also thought she saw a shadow inside our Astro van, tinted windows. Someone unknown to my grandmother on the phone said, "I know you're in there," and hung up. At this point, we're all scared and crying, waiting 30 to 45 minutes for the cops to show up. Finally, we see a police officer in the driveway and we all run outside. He starts taking a report of what happens with the money, car door, and phone call. As he's writing everything down, I yell to my mom, "There's smoke coming from the top of the house, backside." My grandmother freaks thinking she left a pot of beans on the stove and maybe the kitchen caught fire. The police officer looks up and sees the smoke, calls in the fire department and runs inside the house instructing everyone to stay outside. Moments later he comes back outside and is completely bewildered. Nothing is on fire and the smoke outside is gone. Fire department and backup police arrive. They search the house and nearby land. Nothing. To this day, we have no clue what happened, who the person was, where the money went, how they knew my grandmother's phone number, and what caused the smoke. The only speculation we made was the phone call was probably made from inside our van as we had a mobile bag phone, before cell phones were popular. I was terrified as a kid and still shudder when thinking back on this. One night I woke up to yelling and crashing and walked into the living room to see my dad fistfighting a complete stranger. He beat the absolute shit out of him and threw him down the stairs into our unfinished basement and locked the door since that was the only way in or out of there and called the police. Guy thought nobody was home and decided to try to burglarize the place and walked around the corner and bumped right into my dad in the dark who was half asleep on his way to the bathroom. Don't know how scary this would be to anyone else, but the scariest thing to happen to me was when I was living in a tiny little town called Ney in Ohio. The house we were living in at the time always gave me the creeps and it only was made worse after a few months of living there. I stayed home one night while the family went to grab some food from the town over. While I was watching TV downstairs, I started hearing footsteps go from the room right above me and cross the hall to the room right across from above me. It kept going back and forth for about 15 minutes until I went to the bottom of the staircase and that's when the footsteps came out of the room and stopped right at the top of the stairs. Scared the hole out of me and after that I refused to stay home alone. My grandma and I almost died from a gas leakage. She noticed something was wrong, got up and immediately collapsed. I was in bed watching TV and I didn't realize I was lightheaded until I got up to help her. I was not able to sit straight so I had to crawl on my floor, leaning against the wall. We lived in a yard with multiple houses and my parents were in the house next to my grandmother's so I had to continue crawling even if I was barely able to hold any balance whatsoever and I was also very confused. I managed to enter the hallway and go in front of their room. They saw me, looked very concerned and then I collapsed. Next thing I know I was in my parents' bed tucked in. Fortunately everything was fine with both of us, but scary and confusing AF.